This week, we are going to talk about social psychology. So, what is social psychology? Social psychology is actually the study of how individuals or groups influence our thoughts, behaviors, and emotions. In other words, we're looking at the way that people or the perceived presence of other people influences our behaviors. So there's several different concepts in social psychology, and we're going to hit on a few of them. And one of these is the bystander effect. The bystander effect is a term that was identified and coined from the murder of Kitty Genovese. So back in the 1960s, Kitty was a young single female who was attacked and murdered by a stranger. Several people heard her scream, but nobody came to her rescue. So why was that? Why did people just allow her to get murdered? So one of the reasons goes back to the bystander effect. It's because with the bystander effect, when there's so many different people and you know somebody else is also observing what you're observing or hearing what you're hearing, you think that somebody else is going to help that person. So you sit back. It's also called a diffusion of responsibility. So the responsibility is diffused amongst other people. So we just assume somebody else is going to help this person. If we would have been the only one and who witnessed or observed or heard the murder of Kitty Genovese, we might have stepped in. But because there were so many other witnesses, we just became complacent and we just felt somebody else would do something. So think about how this might even work in your own life and where you've seen this happen in your own life. I know with me, one incident that comes to mind is not too long ago when we were going to a volleyball tournament. And there was this young girl, probably in her 20s, who was actually standing outside the front door of the facility, and she was vomiting. Now, vomit is not my specialty, and I cringe and I run away from it. However, I think the mom instinct took over, but I also noticed that everybody just kept walking by this gal. And so I actually went over there and patted her on the back, asked her if she was okay, and then ran inside and got some cold rags for her and sat her down. And it turned out, she said she just found out she was pregnant. I was relieved. I was glad to know that she wasn't sick and contagious. However, one of the things that was observed from that is all the people that walked by. There were so many people that walked by, but nobody stopped to check on this gal. So that was an example of the bystander effect. Everybody else thought somebody else would check on her. So think about where you've observed this and how maybe you were even involved in part of the bystander effect. The Stanford Prison Experiment. This was the most famous, or should I say infamous, social psychology experiment of all time. And this social psychology experiment actually occurred in 1971 in the basement of Stanford University. What happened was Dr. Zimbardo, who was a professor at Stanford University, decided he was going to do this experiment. He wanted to find out, he wanted to learn more about prison behavior. So what he did was he put out a flyer advertising or trying to solicit participants for this particular experiment. Now, the motivation here was that these participants would be paid $15 a day. In 1971, $15 a day was pretty good money, especially for the starving college students. And so several people replied to this flyer and agreed to participate. And each of them underwent a psychological assessment to make sure that there wasn't any deficits or there wasn't any struggles that could interfere with the study itself. So one night, these participants, the ones that were chosen to participate, were picked up from their homes by the police and arrested. And they were brought to the basement of Stanford University. And what happened next is honestly quite alarming. But what happened next was what they did was they separated the participants into prisoners and into guards. With the prisoners, this is very important because with the prisoners, they stripped them of their clothes and they put them all in this gown. And so the point was they wanted to take away their identity. It was part of dehumanizing. So they wanted to dehumanize them, take away their identity. They gave them each numbers and they would be called by their numbers and not by their names. They were all put into jail cells. And then we have the guards. And so the guards were given props. They were given sunglasses. And so the whole point of the sunglasses is that sense of anonymity. So if you're wearing sunglasses, nobody can really see you and they cannot see your eyes. So we're more prone to do things maybe a little more deviant if we have sunglasses on. They were also given this authority and given these batons and given the authority to crack down on the prisoners. So they were encouraged by Dr. Zimbardo to be tough and maybe even a little rough and demeaning to the prisoners. There was isolation, sleep deprivation. It was a very real simulation, and it began to get out of hand because what happened is we began to see that the prisoners took on the role of prisoners and they became they developed what we call a sense of learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is when we feel like we don't have any control. When we try to escape, but we can't escape. We feel like a lack of control. So then we just stop trying. We stop trying to get out of that situation and we become depressed. The sleep deprivation also had a significant effect on the mental stability of these prisoners at the time. And also what we saw was these guards being very emotionally and even physically aggressive with the prisoners. They began to take on the role of prison guards. So they began to take on the expectations of that role, and they began to treat the prisoners based on this role that they have taken. So things began to get out of hand. And around the 6th day, Dr. Zimbardo's girlfriend came down the basement stairs to check on everything. She wanted to see how the study was going. She hadn't heard from Dr. Zimbardo, so she wanted to come check on things. And what she saw was totally alarming. She was shocked by the condition not only of the prisoners, but the brutal treatment from the guards. And also, she was shocked to see that her boyfriend, Dr. Zimbardo, was caught up in the study. He had taken on this role of warden, and he was caught up in the study. So she actually was the one that put a stop to this experiment. She said, no way. It was supposed to go on for 2 weeks, but on the 6th day, they shut everything down. And so what we really learned from this experiment were several things. One thing that we learned was that people take on the role that they've been given. So in other words, they take on this role. If they're a prisoner, they begin to take on this role of prisoner, develop a sense of learned helplessness. If they've been given the role of a guard, they begin to take on that power and control that's expected of the prison guards. So we really begin to see how good people can turn evil when they've been given certain roles in society, and how they take on this power and control. When we look at the ethics in this study, because this is something that has been brought up repeatedly, that this study was unethical. I mean, it sounds horrible and unethical, but when we look at the context and the time period, which was in the early 1970s, we really did not have those guidelines for research that we have today. Because of this study, we have the ethical codes and ethical standards of research that we have today. In this study, Dr. Zimbardo, he did obtain informed consent from the prisoners. So he followed the ethical guidelines that were in place at the time. Today, an experimenter, a researcher, would not be able to be involved in his or her own study to the extent where he becomes part of the study. Also, research today you cannot create situations that could be psychologically harmful to the individual, to the subjects, to the participants in the study. And while this experiment does sound like it was psychologically harmful, I will say that the prisoners and the prison guards were debriefed afterwards, and they even met years later to talk about this experiment. And all of them said that they did not experience any long-term effects or PTSD from this experiment. In fact, they each really appreciated having that opportunity to be part of this experiment and learn from this experiment. So it was really quite fascinating. Be sure to watch that video in the classroom. And there's even a movie that's come out that's depicted the Stanford Prison experiment. Another famous social psychology experiment is the Milgram Obedience Study. And this experiment took place in the 1960s at Yale University. Dr. Stanley Milgram was interested in obedience, especially after the trials from World War II and Hitler, and he really wanted to understand how Hitler was able to get thousands of people to obey his commands. So he devised a study where there was participants, and these participants were to ask this other person a question, and if the other person got the question wrong, the participant was told to shock the other person who was actually on the other side of this room and behind this voltage machine. So Dr. Milgram asked these participants, would tell these participants, you've got to shock them because they got that question wrong. So the participants would turn that dial and shock that person that was on the other side. And what's interesting here, and what the participants did not realize, was that person who was on the other side was really just an actor. So they weren't really getting shocked. They were just pretending to get shocked. They would groan, they would scream, they would cry, and the participants continued to shock. Even though it was horrifying to them, the look on their face, they They were in agony having to shock this person. But the experimenter, the researcher himself, Dr. Milgram, would tell them, you've got to shock, turn it higher, you've got to shock them more. And so these participants would obey, at least supposedly in 65% of the time. 65% of the participants obeyed and continued to obey. So what does this say about obedience? Well, one of the things that we found from this study is that people, the more authority-like this figure is, for instance, Dr. Milgram was wearing a lab coat and he was very serious. So that really played a huge role in the participants' willingness to be obedient to the commands. And so what happened was these participants were obviously, they were upset about having to shock this other person, but they did it anyway. So why did they do it anyway? That's that was the big question in this. And as we found out, and as I mentioned just previously, one of the reasons was because somebody in authority was telling them to do so. And even though shocking this other person went against their values and their beliefs, they did it anyway. So from this, we actually have another term called cognitive dissonance, which was observed in this study. Cognitive dissonance is simply when we engage in a behavior that goes against our own values and beliefs and creates a sense of discomfort. So that's what we saw in this study. We saw that these people, despite that cognitive dissonance, they continue to engage in shocking these people. So that's one of the things that you need to really remember about this study is the importance, that people will be obedient when they're given these orders. Now, this experiment was conducted in 1960. Would people obey today like they did in 1960? Who knows? I mean, would you obey if you were being told by somebody, some authority-looking person that was standing right over you, telling them that you must continue, you must keep shocking this person? So think about where in your own life you've done something that went against your values and your morals and your beliefs, and how did that make you feel? So another important experiment in social psychology is the Asch conformity experiment. This experiment is a little more gentle than the two that we just previously talked about. In this experiment, Dr. Asch really wanted to study conformity. Why do people conform? Conform just means going along with the group. And in this experiment, Dr. Asch primed a group of actors. In other words, these people were in on the study. And he told them, what I want you to do is I want you to look at this line right here. And although A is the same length as the line, I want you guys to choose C. So they're all ready to choose C. So what he did was Dr. Asch brought in the participant into the group. And the participant, of course, thinks that everybody's participating. All the group members are with him and part of the experiment. And Dr. Asch asks the group, which line is the same length as the line on the left? Well, the participant says, wow, he's thinking this is obvious. Of course it's A. But the rest of the group says it's C. Everybody in the group said C. So what do you think the participant did? Yeah, the participant changed his mind. Even though he knew the right answer was A, he didn't want to be the only one to say A. So he went along with the group and changed his answer to C, even though he knew that wasn't right. So really what this showed us was just really about conformity, how we're prone to go along with the group, especially if we're the only one who thinks differently. So anyway, I really want you guys to remember these experiments in social psychology. These are the most important ones. And to really think about how your behaviors and your thoughts are influenced by the presence or the perceived presence of others.